Well, thank you guys for having me. My name is Amy Harris, and I am a freelance photojournalist. And I am going to be talking and presenting today on what I'm calling civil unrest in America in 2020. Um, Typically, I am a photographer and a writer and an engineer, and I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, and part-time in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I specialize in music and entertainment photography. But for the past 3 months, with the outbreak of coronavirus in America in March, all of my normal summer music and entertainment activities have been canceled. And so for the past 3 months, I have pivoted to news coverage of civil unrest in the United States following the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Typically, my work can be seen being on assignment for Rolling Stone or AP Images. Usually cover all the music festivals, the major ones in the summer for AP. And my photos have been published in New York Times and Washington Post and the Guardian and all kinds of other, publications over the years. My photo gear that I use, I am a Nikon shooter. I have two Nikon D5 cameras and that I use primarily, and Nikkor lenses that really all the Nikkor lenses, 70 to 200, 24 to 120, 24 to 70, 12 to 24, 80 to 400, 200 to 400, and 35 millimeter prime. Usually, when I shoot music, I always carry two bodies and two lenses, primarily a 24 to 120 millimeter and a 70 to 200, because typically I usually have a very short time to capture music images, and there's not enough time to actually change lenses while I'm doing that. And so these lenses give me a good variety for those live events. Over the past year or so, actually 2 years, I've actually also acquired some Sony cameras. I have a Sony A9 and A7, and I have two Sony lenses, which are the 24 to 105 and the 100 to 400. And I got introduced to the Sony when I was shooting sports. I shoot some tennis and I've shot basketball in the past. And the Sony works really great with that 100 to 400 millimeter lens that can be handheld. And so I do prefer using the Sony with sports and street photography. Another issue that I've had over the years is I've had tennis elbow that's developed because of the weight of the Nikon cameras. And so the Sony camera is much less weight usually to carry, but I tend to always kind of go back to those Nikon cameras because I am more comfortable using them. And they're made to be very, very strong and in tough conditions. So here's just a few photos of my live music photography. Typically I do specialize in live music, real-time performances with bands. I love rock music. So you can see a photo here of Dave Grohl and Kiss on their final tour. Shooting conditions can vary with music. I can be very up close and personal in the photo pit like with Dave Grohl, or I can be sent to the back of the arena like in this Kiss photo, but you still have to kind of make it work in these really changing light situations. But I love music, and I always tell people to shoot what you love because I think it comes across in your work. And so I do love music, and so I shoot all different types of music, all different genres, all across the U.S., whether it's tours or the big festivals. So with music photography, it's really rigid. Actually, for doing it, you have to apply in advance for each event that you're going to cover. You either do this with the publicist, the record label, or the venue. A lot of time you have to be on assignment, so Associated Press would need to apply for me to actually prove that I'm actually working and going to be able to publish the images. So you do need an outlet to shoot. Over the years, I've developed, really strong relationships with a lot of publicists and record labels and venues across America. And so they do trust me at this point. They know who I am. So they might be a little less restrictive on assignment letters because they know that I'm a legit photographer at this point. There's a lot of people who want to do this. They're willing to do it for free. So it's a very competitive type of photography. It's very regulated on where and how much you can shoot. Typically, you're going to be in the photo pit or the soundboard, and usually only for the first 2 to 3 songs. So you really do have a limited time frame to capture the images. You're going to be in there with quite a few other people in a very tight space that you're trying to maneuver. And, it could be a little stressful to do that. It's very competitive due to the short time frame and the limited space. And so what I tell people, if you're interested in doing, live music photography, is always to start practicing in clubs and local venues, because that's where I got my start and learned in really terrible, dark lighting conditions, because it does take practice. I've been doing live music photography since 2008. And so lots of years and lots of publications. Unfortunately, I've seen kind of the dying out of print photography and having music magazines around. They keep getting smaller and smaller, but there is still quite a draw and an online presence for music photography. So why did I just decide to go out and cover protests? In March with coronavirus, when all my music events got canceled, I actually didn't go out for like 60 days. I was not taking any sort of COVID assignments. I just really didn't know what to do. I was trying to update, archive my travel photography and work on a blog. But a couple events obviously happened that made me kind of get up and be willing to go out and take the risk. And obviously one of the events was on March 25th, George Floyd died in police custody while being detained by the police in Minneapolis. Derek Chauvin held his knee on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds as he cried out for help. And the incident was videotaped. So all of America and the world got to see this happen. But even at that point, I still wasn't sure how to get involved. Seemed dangerous. And so a few events happened that week. Obviously riots and protests started in Minneapolis, but they broke out all across the country in support of Black Lives Matter. And on August 29th, I got up, and it was a Friday morning, and I saw a CNN reporter get arrested live on air while covering the protests. And it became really apparent that they were also attacking journalists and just kind of without regard of the Constitution. And that same day, President Trump tweeted that if you loot, we shoot, to his millions of followers, suggesting violence toward protesters. And so at that point, I kind of had enough, and I called my husband, Brian, and was like, I'm going out, like, that's it. And I've pretty much been shooting ever since that May 29th date, on and off throughout, I think 11 cities at this point across America. So that's what you're going to see here today, is kind of the story of many of the cities that I've actually covered. I really have tried to cover both sides of the story. So you'll see images from Black Lives Matter protests, as well as pro-police protests, as well as the Trump rally and the Juneteenth celebration in Tulsa. So I really have tried to kind of keep some journalistic integrity throughout this. I obviously have personal feelings. It's hard not to as you go out and cover these events, but I really have tried to be fair in providing coverage from both sides. So when you do protest photography, it's very different than music photography. I'm going to say at the beginning, I'm not an expert at this. I can only share kind of what I've learned the past 90 days as I've been out doing this. But there is some research required. You have to figure out where to go. And it can feel a little bit like whack-a-mole sometimes, because there's so much going on. There's so many things happening, and it's really hard to know whether you're going to be at the right place at the right time. And unfortunately, a lot of this is happening on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and some of the protests have even kind of gone underground, where it's really hard to figure out what's happening because of the police reaction to the protests. So there is no applying for credentials for protest photography. You just show up and you do your best. I do find that I always wear a press pass. I'm a member of different organizations, professional photography organizations, and in PPA, for example, I wear their press badge. I also have a U.S. Press Association badge. I do want people to know that I am press. I'm not trying to blend in the crowd. I'm not trying to be an activist. There's people doing that everywhere. They're showing up, putting press on their clothes and tape, and then they're actively participating in the protests. And I'll talk about a little bit later, like why that is causing some problems. But I do want to everybody to know that I am going to be taking their picture, and the pictures could be published. I will say that as I started this, even though I haven't been shooting a lot of the protests for AP at the beginning, AP did call and give me advice because some of their photographers were violently attacked in some of the early protests in Minneapolis and Philadelphia. And so one of the things that they told me was take a buddy or find a buddy at the protests. And this has served me well. A lot of times at the beginning, I was hanging out with the actual live news crews that were there because, they're on air live. And if I stayed close to them, the chances of something happening was lower. Toward kind of a week into it, they also started bringing armed security with the news crews. So I also felt safer kind of having some level of security. There are new concerns about photographing protesters that kind of have happened since this May time period. There's a lot of rumors, a lot of information floating around that protesters are being doxxed, or basically people are seeking them out online to try to ruin their life or get them arrested or fine them. And so there's this ethical debate now about whether you should be blurring protesters' images of their faces so that they can't be recognized. Obviously, from an AP standpoint or wire photographer standpoint, I'm not allowed to blur anyone's faces. I have been threatened while I've been doing this from the protester side on multiple occasions, probably in every city, about how I need to take their rights into account. But the bottom line is if you are out protesting in a public area, in a public street, I have the right to photograph you. And that's been a really tough call in some cases. And usually if people ask me not to take their picture, I try not to, unless it's a newsworthy type situation, because there is some sort of self-preservation that's needed in these situations where you don't want the crowd turning on you either. So I try to be as polite as I can. I tell people to wear a mask, which they should be doing anyway for COVID, to cover their face, which already kind of covers up their identity. But this has actually been a real issue with press photographers covering some of these events. And I'm not sure if you guys have heard about it. You also need to be aware of your surroundings. You need to be prepared to walk a lot. I've joked this summer that I've kind of been on the riot diet, which is long walks with some of these protesters in some very hilly cities. In Cincinnati, they would walk, 6 to 8 to 10 miles a day every time we went out for a protest. So you really do need to be prepared. A lot of times they do not tell you where you're going. The protests will start in a location and then they will march, and they will not give you the end location. And so you just have to be prepared to walk as far as they're going to go. Sometimes it's a few blocks and sometimes it can be many miles away. You need to stay hydrated, and then definitely use the proper PPE. And there are things that I've purchased in the past few months that I never thought I would own. I have a helmet, I have respirators for tear gas, I have goggles, I have a bulletproof vest now, Kevlar vest, because things have turned and can turn to be very volatile at times. Even protests that you think are going to be peaceful in the middle of the day, something can happen very quickly and they can turn very volatile. So gotten to the point now where I always carry kind of protective equipment, and obviously a mask. It's interesting because for the most part, the protests that I've covered, people are wearing masks. They hand out masks, surgical masks for people's protection for COVID. And so I've been kind of pleased with the situation of, the PPE on people as well. So I'm going to start kind of in a chronological time frame with kind of that May 29th weekend, where I stayed close to home. I went to Columbus, Cincinnati, and Indianapolis the first weekend, and sometimes I did all three of those cities in one day because there were so many protests that were scheduled. So I'm just going to talk through some of these photographs. My first shoot was, as I said, the evening of May 29th was a Friday. I drove to Columbus, and I did a peaceful protest where people were just on the corner and showing that they supported the Black Lives Matter initiative. And, no drama. The police didn't even show up. They would go out and block the intersection for 2 minutes and then kind of go back to the sidewalks. It was a very kind of tame introduction to the protest. On Saturday morning, when I went back home that night in Cincinnati, I got home about 11 p.m. and then I heard that there was actually another protest happening right then downtown Cincinnati. So I hopped in the car, drove back down, and actually saw kind of a small group of people being met with a very large police presence. One of the things that I will note is that in the beginning, at least the first week or two, several of these cities had no history with dealing with riots or protests of any size. And so the police, it was very obvious with the police reactions that they did not have experience of knowing how to deal with these situations. The Cincinnati Police Department had riots back in 2001, and so they had already had kind of police reform, police overhaul. They have a community oversight committee. They actually aren't allowed to use any hand weapons anymore, like sticks or batons. So those have been banned because of a death that actually occurred during those 2001 riots. So overall, Cincinnati police have been extremely patient and really haven't had the type of incidents that I've seen in the other cities. And so you might see a lot of riot gear, a lot of riot police, but there hasn't been what I would consider a lot of police brutality at the protests per se that I've witnessed in Cincinnati. They're very patient and they'll wait for long periods of time and kind of take the abuse from the crowd. Whereas in other cities, they get very impatient and they react a lot quicker. So this night, obviously the riot team was out. They were walking, this kid wouldn't get out of the way. They pushed him down. But again, no real injuries. What I saw the first night in downtown Cincinnati for a fairly small group of people. They broke a few windows. I didn't see any looting that was happening. So a pretty tame, even though this was a little bit stressful shooting situation, they still weren't macing. They would shoot a few pepper balls at the ground. Very kind of mild situation. Things kind of took a turn the next morning. I went to Columbus. There was a very large protest that was planned at the state capitol. It started about 10:30 or 11 in the morning. So very, very early on a Saturday. There was really nobody downtown Columbus. Everything's kind of closed for COVID. They had a really large turnout. So there were thousands of people there. A lot of them college students that go to Ohio State, but a very, very large crowd. So you can see here in the picture, these policemen kind of in their full riot gear with these bikes. Another thing that really tried to figure out through some of this is why they had tape on their uniforms. A lot of rumors around, were they covering up their body cameras? Were they covering up their names? Were they somehow marking themselves so they knew who each other were? So there was just a lot of unknowns at this point as well throughout the protest. But you can see the very large crowd. They had told the crowd they had to stay on the sidewalk. Obviously that didn't last long because of the large numbers. And so the crowd kind of took over this crosswalk in the street. And again, downtown Columbus is not busy. So this is just kind of a test of will and how long we're willing to wait. I do like this photo. Things you notice when you get back, kind of the George Floyd hashtag up in the top, and trying to frame things of these standoffs between really unarmed, college students against a heavily armed police force, basically, is what you're going to kind of see throughout a lot of these pictures. People that are armed with signs, shields, pictures, really no weapons from the protester side. And so the crowd obviously was warned to disperse. Usually something that happens at these protests was somebody will throw a water bottle or something at the police, and the reaction back on the crowd was about 100 times what had just happened. So this was actually, the reason I put this in here is this was the first time that I was actually maced, was about 11 a.m. on that Saturday morning. And so that was not a pleasant experience. I also quickly learned that I'm not always going to have tack sharp photos in these situations. Like, I just keep pushing the button and you kind of hope for the best in some of these situations. But you can see here that people are shielding, people are running, people are trying to escape this. But you don't see, really anybody fighting back with the police here. They made a lot of arrests during these times. You'll see them being arrested. There are legal observers that are on site and they're yelling for have them give their names. There's bail funds to try to get people out of jail, to make sure they're taken care of if they are out peacefully protesting, which was the case of this girl. Here you can see another case where people are really not doing anything except being in the street. They'd come out and sat down in the street to kind of make a wall peacefully, and they're getting maced directly by the police. After they maced the crowd, then they started making announcements that it's an unlawful assembly. Usually this happens for a few minutes. They'll make multiple announcements. Please leave, this is an unlawful assembly. Usually people do not leave at that point, the ones that are resilient, and that is when they actually tear gas the crowd for the first time. Also, this was my first tear gas experience in Columbus that morning. I went to Columbus in the middle of the morning, not anticipating that this would be the scene that I would deal with. So you can see here, this is someone who has been either tear gas in their eye or maced in their eye, being treated. They have medics that are with the protesters. They have medic stations. It's a very organized effort to take care of each other. They have water, they have food, and they have these mixtures of baking soda or Maalox and water that they pour in people's eyes to clean them out. You can also see in this picture a phone number written on the arm of this girl, and that's the actual bail number, the bail relief number that they give everyone and tell them to write it on their arm in Sharpie. So you can see here they're trying to treat someone in pain, and I have to say that these people, these medics, have also been the people who have helped me the most when I've been hurt throughout this process. So I am thankful for these people. And one of the things that I always tell people when I talk about this is that I've kind of seen the best in humanity and the worst in humanity. I've seen people that are strangers who don't know each other, who are just helping people that they don't even know. And so that was kind of what this photo is. That same day, I actually drove to Indianapolis. I kind of regrouped for a few hours, went to Cincinnati, shot a quick protest that was peaceful, and then I kept driving on to Indianapolis. It was a busy day. About 8 minutes after I arrived in Indianapolis, kind of this was the scene. You see, again, familiar, the crowd kind of facing off with police. This was happening in 2 or 3 locations around the downtown Indianapolis area. Again, someone threw a water bottle, and then a large response was given from the police. This was another tear gas incident. This is when I learned firsthand that there are different grades of tear gas. The tear gas that was used in Columbus was, I guess, what I would consider mild. This tear gas made me throw up and have to retreat from the area. This was much stronger, shot out of cannons, and obviously a different type of tear gas. And so obviously you just get yourself back together. If you just have to breathe through it, you keep your eyes open, you keep blinking, they clean out your eyes, and then you go back in. It's sounds crazy, but it's not as bad as you would think. And this was before I had any respirator type equipment. and considering before this, I had never even played paintball, this has been an interesting experience. Here is a protester getting arrested during this time. You know, people who won't disperse after they say that it's an unlawful assembly, they can actually arrest people for being out after curfew. That was another one of the tactics that they used at the beginning of this, is that they put in curfews in all these cities at like 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. And all it did was just give the protesters and the police a time to meet in person. And so a lot of the cities also learned that the curfew wasn't a great idea because it just caused more problems. Same with the tear gas. Most of these cities that you're seeing like are not allowing tear gas anymore. Or like in Louisville's case, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, the mayor himself has to sign off on any use of tear gas. In the Columbus protest that I was at, a girl actually passed away and died after that protest because she had asthma. And so a lot of these police departments, including Indianapolis Police Department, have lawsuits, many lawsuits that have been brought against them for police brutality and the way that they've treated peaceful protesters during this time. So here's another scene. This kind of looks surreal to me. This, like, downtown Indianapolis kind of looked like a war zone, which is a place that I go to shoot concerts and sports a lot. And so this was kind of a crazy scene this evening. After this, people actually showed up or walked down the street. They did a lot of looting. They did a lot of damage of downtown businesses as well. So I'm not going to say, like, one of the things I've made it very clear is that these protests have not been, 100% peaceful. Everybody's saying, oh, they're peaceful. There is definitely agitation on the side of the protesters. They're saying terrible things to the police, horrible things. They're really trying to get a response. They're there to make a point. They're not following instructions, given by the police by nature of it being a protest. And so I've kind of seen what I would consider poor behavior on all sides. But, like I said, the police were coming at these protesters with a lot more force than was being given to them in most of the cases at the beginning. The following day was Sunday in Cincinnati. I went out and did some peaceful protests. Again, there's still massive crowds that were showing up. This is a large protest at the Justice Center where the group showed up and kneeled for 8 minutes and 46 seconds in tribute to George Floyd, and really tried to make, it be uncomfortable. On June 1st, again, Monday, it was clear at this point to me that I wasn't going to stop. I was going to keep going and trying to cover this as much as possible. I went to downtown Cincinnati, and this is Young Activist Coalition, a peaceful protest in downtown at the Justice Center. And they were this group was met with the Sheriff's Department. The Sheriff's Department in Cincinnati had gotten some flack this morning because they had put up a thin blue line flag outside of the courthouse, caused a huge backlash. I think it made more people show up. They took the flag down, and you could see here, this scene was a little bit disturbing at times because this is an actual real weapon. With the police standing there, a lot of the other pictures that you'll see, they'll have kind of the pepper ball guns, kind of the what I would consider non-lethal weapons. But this was a scene where this person was standing 6 feet, 5 feet from the protesters with actual, automatic weapons. This day, after the backlash, the sheriff actually came out. This is when a lot of the protesters across the country were asking the police to kneel with them in solidarity. And so the Sheriff Jim Neal here in Cincinnati, he came out and actually did kneel and did an interview with the local news crew. It did calm down this crowd. This ended up being a completely peaceful protest. They dispersed, but you can see here kind of along the line, the all the police lined up kind of facing off with a large crowd right there in front of the Justice Center. From a photo standpoint, tried to frame it. There's always a lot of stuff going on in these pictures, but wanted the eye focus to be on him because he's kneeling, and then the sign kind of get the police, him, and the signage and the protesters. So a lot of times with these, you don't have a lot of time to frame and make it pretty, but when you can do that, it's more impactful. And then June 6th, went back to Indianapolis. There were protests every day in Indianapolis. These were just some of my favorite images, people walking. There's beautiful light. So if you could have a beautiful protest photo, these last two of the Midwest kind of were two of my favorites. So it was an actual protester with a sign, and then an American flag, which you'll see, upside down American flag, which you'll see is symbolic in a lot of the photos that I'll actually be showing you. After this, I went to Nashville. I'm originally from Tennessee, and I had heard about a protest that was actually going to be happening in Nashville, which is not a big protest town, with these young girls, teenage girls, called Teens for Equality. And they were organizing a march in support of Black Lives Matters in downtown Nashville on June 4th, which is a Thursday. So I went down for it. And this was really amazing because this group of leaders, which is 6 teenage girls, were aged 14 to 16. And they were able to get upwards of 15 to 20,000 people showed up to march on a Thursday afternoon in downtown Nashville, which was kind of unheard of. And so it was very kind of inspiring to see these girls being able to do this. And they were moved, they were crying. It was very emotional for them to see what they were actually able to pull off, and really felt strongly about the cause. So I was very happy that I went down and covered this because, this was something that just seeing young girls and being leaders to inspire other people to do this was really amazing. This is what the march looked like. I included this photo in here for a reason. It's actually one of my favorite photos I've taken through this whole thing, but I actually took this photo on an iPhone. I have an iPhone 11 Pro, and it does wide angle, and I just pull it out occasionally and take some photos to share on Facebook or Instagram. And this was one of the photos that I actually took with the phone. I ran it on The Wire. It got published, like Good Morning America ran it. So kind of it is true, like the best camera you have is the one in your hand sometimes. And the iPhone technology has gotten so great as well. So especially in daylight conditions, this is kind of the quality that you can get. This is a case too where I was trying to get a high angle. I do try to get above things when possible. So I climbed up on these walls and held the phone above my head. So it even gave it a higher angle. Sometimes I can't do that with the actual camera. And so, just kind of looking for different angles, because if you're down in these crowds, sometimes the photos just all start to look the same. This photo, to me, again, this is Broadway, Lower Broadway in Nashville, where all the honky tonks are outside Bridgestone Arena. This was a powerful photo to me because I feel like a lot of the African-American officers that are involved with these police departments are getting a really large brunt of abuse, during these. They're targeted during these rallies and questioned why they're there, what they're standing for. And so this is the gentleman on his knees kind of talking to or trying to have a conversation with this policeman who's also African American. And to me, this was just a powerful moment when they were trying to have some dialogue. Could tell they're, sometimes I try to focus on details, and, obviously they were ready to make some arrests here. I don't know that anybody was arrested this day. I didn't see any arrests. It remained peaceful on this march to the Capitol through downtown. This was kind of an interesting photo to me because I grew up in Nashville. Tootsie's Orchid Lounge has been at the center of a lot of this COVID controversy of trying to open up with Steve Smith, the owner. And, it's just an interesting scene downtown that these police were very much trying to protect these businesses in this area. It was an interesting dynamic. And then here you can see kind of the Bridgestone Arena in the background, which is symbolic of Nashville. And, sometimes with these cities, I'm trying to get images that actually make sure that you could tell what city it's in, to show that this really was a nationwide type event. So the next set of images that I have are really centered around Louisville, Kentucky. One of the names that you've heard, I'm sure, throughout this whole Black Lives Matters effort is George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor. And Breonna Taylor is an EMT that's in Louisville, who was killed by police in her own home. So one of the things that has struck me in every city that I've visited is that you'll always hear George Floyd plus other names. So there are hundreds and hundreds of names across America in these cities of people who've been killed at the hands of police and with police brutality. And so it's been very emotional to hear it and to spend time in Louisville because it's close to my home. The name that you hear is Breonna Taylor. And Breonna Taylor, for those of you who don't know, is a 26-year-old African-American EMT. She was fatally shot in Louisville in her home. The names of the police officers are here on March 13th, 2020, while they were executing a no-knock warrant. They came into her house. They were not in police clothes. They were in street clothes, ununiformed policemen. Her boyfriend shot at them thinking that the house was being broken into, with a legal gun that he owned in his possession. And they shot back and actually shot her 8 times, and she was killed in her house, in her bed. And her boyfriend was actually arrested and kept in jail for several weeks, until they dropped all the charges and let him go. So every day, I think it's 89 days today, and tomorrow will be the 90th day of protest, where I'll be going back to Louisville to protest Breonna Taylor at what they're calling Injustice Square downtown at 6th and Jefferson in downtown Louisville, outside the police department and civic buildings. So this group is trying to bring awareness, keep saying her name, because the police have not been arrested in this case. Only one of the police officers has been fired. The other 2 have not, and no charges have been brought. So there's a lot of national attention on this, to try to have some resolution. So I try to, I've been down to Louisville a lot. I was there this weekend, all weekend, and I'll go back tomorrow. There's supposed to be a very large march tomorrow with thousands of people. But again, I like this image. It's kind of a portrait. I like it that it's a mask. I like it that it has her name, her hashtag, and it's kind of telling of the time of COVID and being out with the protest. This is a civil rights icon, the Reverend Charles Elliott Jr. He came out to actually speak to the protesters on June 1st when I was there. He spoke a lot about how it was time for the younger generation to take the lead. He was actually with Martin Luther King Jr. when he was in Louisville, had been arrested, had really been through the whole civil rights movement. So he really did an inspiring speech for the crowd that was there that day, and it was a very large crowd. I will also mention that this was the day after the National Guard had also killed someone David McAtee, who had been not really even part of the protest, was at his business down the street in Louisville. The National Guard was trying to get people to disperse. He ran in his building and they shot and they killed him as well. So there was a lot of tension in Louisville this day. The National Guard had been deployed a few days earlier, the Kentucky National Guard. And so the crowds were very large. This whole group of thousands of people marched down to the site, 26 and Broadway, where David McAtee had been killed as well, and then came back to the square. So there were definitely thousands of people involved in this protest. The police were trying to have some dialogue at that point. Again, coming out to try to peacefully talk to some of the protesters, kneeling, taking in their complaints, their concerns, listening. So it looked like there was some some opening of dialogue that was actually happening. You can see here a picture of the actual National Guard trucks of the troops that were being brought in. This same day, there were helicopters above us. There were people stationed on all these buildings. You can kind of see up here on top of the buildings, we're being watched. They were going to ultimately, which you'll see later, fire upon us from the top of these buildings as well. But there was a heavy police presence and a heavy National Guard presence. This is actually a scene with a curfew, where the curfew was just happening. The people were not leaving. They were talking a lot about David McAtee. You know, his body was like basically left in the street for 12 hours while they did the investigation. And the Breonna Taylor people here. The opposite side of this, I'll show you in a minute. They were faced off with the local Louisville police and about to have a confrontation because they weren't going to leave with the curfew. Here again, just another scene of cars driving through the area and, you know, having signage. This is the scene that group was facing. You can see here that the Louisville Police Department obviously still used hand weapons. These sticks were used on a nightly basis. I interviewed and photographed one person who had actually been beaten with these sticks and spent the night in jail. He was a young college student as well from Louisville. He'd spent 8 hours in the hospital getting treated for injuries, basically, where he'd been beaten in his back, his neck, probably seriously could have been injured, and he was okay. But there's a reason, I think, why these sticks are not allowed in some cities, because they can do some serious damage. This was kind of the scene when they tear gassed the crowd. This was actually a night where I was shot directly with pepper bullets. I was just sprayed with pepper bullets while I was covering this. It's always hard to know whether you were targeted or whether you were just in the mix, you know, at times. But I had enough hits on me and bruises the next day that, you know, I feel like they could clearly see my camera, that I was taking pictures, and most likely was targeted here. And so this is the entry that I actually put in the press freedom tracker for police brutality against journalism. This was one of the entries that I actually did make because I was frustrated this evening. June 7th, this was actually the birthday weekend of Breonna Taylor. I went back down. They had a kind of a party-like atmosphere at the square, lots of tributes to her. You could see here the happy birthday balloons. So, you know, a lot of times during the day, this is the scene where people are trying to gather and get educated. You can register to vote. You know, and oftentimes the scene, you know, turns different at night when those curfews come into play. But this night, everything remained peaceful. Then on June 11th, I actually went back to Louisville. This is actually Breonna Taylor's mom, Tamika Palmer, and she's with Ben Crump and one of the local congressmen women. And they had actually passed, this was kind of a celebratory day where they had actually passed in Louisville a no knocks warrant. So they basically eliminated those no knock warrants where police can just enter your house without having proper identification, proper announcement of warrants. And so they've actually eliminated that to try to eliminate the way that those are executed in the future, which would hopefully eliminate more people from dying in this way during these types of invasions, basically home invasions. And so this was great. They were celebrating this. Ben Crump is, again, a very famous civil rights attorney. He's also representing George Floyd's family and Ahmaud Arbery's family, and potentially this case in Kenosha as well. Today he's been making comments. So you could see here kind of a happy situation. We actually all stood outside and watched the Louisville City Council vote unanimously to pass this law. And so this was afterward where she came out and actually talked on the steps and thanked, you know, the crowd for being diligent and being there every single day. The next event that I'm going to talk about is Tulsa. Tulsa was Juneteenth weekend. June 19th. I'm going to show some images from the Trump rally. President Trump announced that his first in-person campaign rally since the coronavirus outbreak would be in Tulsa, Oklahoma on June 19th. Obviously, outrage ensued as this coincided with Juneteenth, the celebrated end of slavery in the United States. He was also planning the rally in the city of one of the worst civil rights incidents in American history on Black Wall Street in Tulsa. And then Trump ultimately did move the date of the rally to June 20th. So I decided to drive to Tulsa. At this point, I wasn't flying. A few weeks after this, I actually started flying again, but I was still nervous. So I drove the 11 hours to Tulsa. I will say that when you shoot or photograph the presidents, which I've shot the last 2 presidential elections back from, actually 3, I guess, from 2 of President Obama's, and then the last one with Trump running against Hillary Clinton. You do have to apply for credentials to shoot the president from a photography or media standpoint. So I actually did the online application. It's a very easy form to fill out, but you really don't find out if you're going to be approved until like the day before, sometimes the day of. So it's very kind of risky if you're not from the area, but I had decided I was going to go to Tulsa no matter what, because I wanted to see kind of the atmosphere. They were saying that hundreds of thousands of Trump supporters were going to be there. And then we had the Juneteenth celebration on Black Wall Street. So I was going to go either way. I subsequently found out I was approved to photograph the event on Thursday morning for Saturday. So I was really happy that I was going to actually be able to cover the full experience. So with that, I actually arrived there on June 18th. And so on June 19th, it was a very celebratory kind of situation out in Tulsa on kind of Black Wall Street area, the Greenwood district of Tulsa. And you could actually walk, it was like 0.75 miles from the Greenwood area to where the Trump people were lining up for the actual speech and his campaign rally. So you can see here, just family friendly, everybody was, it was like a carnival almost on Juneteenth. Some great masks and people that were, caught my eye from a visual standpoint, trying to blur the background, do a better portrait of some of these people. Al Sharpton came and spoke. He spoke about how he had had death threats for the event, but it's really important for him to be there and actually support this. And so he came out fully masked until he got out there with his gloves, and really did an encouraging speech for the entire crowd. You can see here they were handing out newspapers to commemorate the event and talk about kind of the history of what happened that day. I was shocked, when I started posting some of this stuff on Facebook, of how many people weren't familiar with the Tulsa massacre that actually happened, or Juneteenth in general. So I think some of this was good because it allowed people to learn about this, unfortunately with this protest, but again, brought some more light on the issue. Like I said, 0.7 miles away, there were people that were lined up for Trump. When I got there, I quickly realized that there probably wasn't going to be hundreds of thousands of people there. They basically were only about 50 people in line when I got there. And so I could tell that, it wasn't going to be the crowd size that we thought it was. And so, but the people that were there were what I called like the super fans, the people that were going to camp out like Grateful Dead style for days and days, like this man dressed as the Wall. And they were very pleasant. Everybody was nice to me on all of these places shooting, but they definitely were hardcore Trump fans. They had a lot of stuff. They had a lot of merch. They were very happy to be hanging out with what they called like-minded people. And they treated it like a tailgate for days and days. I did have people here tell me that they didn't believe COVID was real. It was kind of invented by the Democrats. So I just have to listen, take their picture, and move along. This is the actual day of the rally. This lady was trying to enter with this "I Can't Breathe" shirt on. They actually told her that she was uninvited to the event, even though it was a public event. and she sat down. She wouldn't leave. She knew what she was doing. It was definitely to get attention and make a point, which it was great. So she got taken away and she was actually arrested. That was the only arrest that I saw like during both of these days. You can see here, very heavy National Guard presence. Like it was probably the most militarized presidential photograph event that I've ever done. There were just barricades and tons of military presence. And this girl was handing out masks. They actually gave out masks. They said it was mandatory to take a mask to get your temperature checked before you went in. But obviously once you got in the rally, you didn't have to wear the mask anymore after you got your temperature checked. There's just some fans kind of coming in. The My Pillow guy, who's I guess a staple at these rallies. I mean, many of these people that I talked to had gone to like 40 rallies last year. It was like the biggest music super fans you could ever have with Trump rallies. So people were just explode with applause to see some of these characters and people that came. You can see here, this was the crowd close up. We found out later that obviously they had removed all the social distancing signs from the venue that they had put out to keep people in separate rows and separate areas. So you can see here that everybody was packed in to the areas and very, very happy to be there. And the only people really wearing masks were some of the Secret Service and then like 5 of the press that were there. Sometimes you get lucky with a shot. This is a midair Make America Great Eric Trump shot. But most of this stuff is just normal rally photography. Mike Pence was there. Trump was there. You know, he was very excited to be there. He spoke for over 2 hours while I was there, which was definitely the longest I've ever heard a president speak. This is actually the scene. You know, there's a lot of news about this not being full and whatnot. The arena was definitely not full. They're estimating that about 6,000 people were there total. So you can kind of get a scene for what it actually looked like. The next stop that I went was in Aurora, Colorado. I was actually on vacation out west, doing an out west tour, and I stopped in Denver to see some friends and learned about the story of Elijah McClain. And he died with an encounter with the police while he was walking home August 24th, like almost a year ago this week. He committed no crime. He was autistic, and he died after being held in a chokehold by the police and being sedated by paramedics with fentanyl. He was just totally the wrong person that they grabbed and questioned. And I'm not going to read this, but these were his last words. The reason that I put this in here is because during the protest that I was at, they kept chanting these last words over and over, and it was very emotional. It was the hardest time probably that I've had photographing because of emotion around this, because of how terrible this experience was. And so they all these start with kind of a memorial. We met at the place where the incident occurred with the police. We walked, we started marching. I didn't know where we were going. Started out as a normal march. And then I realized that we were actually going to the Aurora Police Department to surround the police department and try to lock in the 13 officers that were inside. So this was a little scary for me because, you know, obviously this is like could be volatile if they were to break down the door, try to set the building on fire. You just never know what's going to happen. But none of that actually occurred. They actually got the interim police chief on the phone and tried to do some negotiation. But you could see the police were coming out and videoing the crowd. They did use some sound weapons on us. This was the first and only time I've actually had sound weapons used, which was interesting. People blockaded the doors. You can see here, this guy stood at this door for like 5 hours with a group of people. And you can see the police behind that kind of closed door in the back. It was almost like a vigil at some points, but these people were fully prepared to occupy this police station, and they stayed till 4 or 5 in the morning. They brought in a construction site sign and changed it. I don't even know where they get these things half the time. They just roll in. It was kind of impressive. And you can see here how they blockaded the building. and they closed all the roads leading into the police station as well. They built this within like a 4-hour time span on like the 5 roads coming in. So there were a lot of people here as well. This was the day that there had been police officers on the force that had taken a selfie where he had been killed and sent it to the other officers who had done it, kind of in solidarity and making fun of the situation. And they had fired those police officers, but the police officers who actually did the actual event were still employed. I'm going to move through this quickly because I'm running out of time, but I did spend some time in New York City. Lots of great protests. It's very kind of surreal to walk down the middle of the street in New York City. It just seems like such a busy, bustling place, but lots of emotion and lots of people in New York City that are protesting every single day. The Warriors in the Garden are a female-led group, and they did some protests that kind of culminated in the Brooklyn Museum. And this was one of the more emotional protests as well. These women all spoke kind of from their heart. This is Eric Gardner's mother. He was one of the first kind of well-known police incidents where her son was killed in New York City. This is one of my favorite images. Again, just kind of a peaceful protest and kind of showing the beauty of it in New York City. This is the Black Lives Matters mural that's painted that keeps getting vandalized right outside Trump Tower. And this is the type of people who hang out there. There's definitely lots and lots of pro-Trump people that are characters that actually hang out around that area, usually every day. The last protest I did in New York City was July 22nd. I stayed there for a week, and it was pouring rain. It was like hurricane rain, and there were lightning and scary, and these people still persisted. And so this is a policeman trying to get a protester back, kind of putting his hands on her. And here you can see some of the rain, and they kept marching, they kept going, and it was just torrential rain. I was actually worried about my camera gear at this point. But very committed, hundreds of people still marching to City Hall. Another kind of key element of this whole thing has been counter protests. So there have been quite a few protests or counter protests in support of the police. So one of the episodes that I saw was in Philadelphia when Vice President Pence visited the Fraternal Order of Police. And there was a ton of Back the Blue supporters at the event, and they faced off kind of with the Black Lives Matters people. Here's the first time I also saw Proud Boys, which came out to support it, as well as hundreds of bikers. And then on July 12th, 2020, there was a big event in Bay Ridge, New York, it's in Brooklyn, with a very large Back the Blue rally for the NYPD that was met with hundreds of counter protesters and lots of fights and skirmishes. And this was stressful because you've got 3 groups of people you're dealing with that are fighting, with the police in the middle of the 2 groups. And so it was kind of a crazy night. Here you can see the Philadelphia, the Black Lives Matters people standing there. You can see here just a portrait of a Trump supporter. Back the Blue, lots of blue line flags, Proud Boys, bikers, lots of supporters. Some things puzzle me when I see them. Try to have conversations, but sometimes it's difficult. A lot of times they don't want to speak to the press. Here is Bay Ridge, what I was talking about. You've got police, you've got Black Lives Matters, and then you've got pro-Trump, pro-police type of people facing off. So here you can see the giant crowd of pro-police NYPD supporters. And here you can see the big crowd of Black Lives Matters people, and you've got police in between them. Lots of confrontations, lots of skirmishes, burning American flags. This is a protester who's actually trying to tell the other protesters not to be violent or not to cause trouble. So that was also an interesting dynamic. Lots of face-off with the police, lots of police abuse, yelling at the police, bullhorns. So that kind of covers the counter protest. And then kind of, I guess, the most probably important thing that I've done is while I was in New York, the situation in Portland escalated, and I decided to leave New York City and go to Portland. And Portland has been in the news a lot. In July, the federal troops were deployed to the federal courthouse to defend the federal property after protesters had vandalized the building. And the citizens of Portland were not having it. They didn't want the federal troops in their city, so they started nightly protests that drew thousands to confront the officers outside the courthouse. So I spent July 23rd through August 3rd in Portland photographing the protests every night. It was an interesting situation. It was almost like choreographed. Every single night was the same, somewhat from 8 to 10 o'clock every night. There were speeches by Black Lives Matters activists on the stairs of one of the federal buildings, the courthouse, or the building next to the courthouse, excuse me. And people would gather about 10:30. By the day that I got there, they'd built a fence around the perimeter of the actual federal courthouse. The federal troops were inside of the fence, and then the protesters would line up every night outside the fence around 10:30. You guys have probably all seen the Wall of Moms, very much real people, not fake, not actors. It was amazing to actually see moms, dads, lawyers, doctors, nurses showing up in scrubs out there, all to kind of one cause, very united, not fighting, like really focused on getting the feds out of their town. This is the type of crowds that you would see every night, just normal people showing up. I was shocked by some of the things that I saw in Portland. In most of the other cities, one of the things that I'll tell you is that the first time people are tear gassed, they usually go home, much less moms and dads kind of out there. But in Portland, they just basically went up the block, regrouped, and came back in. So these people were actually getting tear gassed and attacked by federal troops 7 to 10 times a night, every single night for 60 days, starting with the Portland police before the feds even got there. So I've never seen quite like the resilience that I saw in Portland. You can see here the veterans became a big thing because they're facing off with other military people, obviously, with the federal troops. Some detail shots that people put up little signs. This is actually the federal troops. There was a hole cut through the fence with the fence cutter, and so I was able to shoot through the fence to get some photos of the actual troops. This is the nightly scene. About between 11 and 12 every night, they would start trying to disperse the crowd with tear gas. They started using leaf blowers to blow the smoke back onto the feds, which was a very effective tactic, which I couldn't believe worked. But it worked so well that we actually saw the feds actually start to get out leaf blowers as well. And you had like this battle of leaf blowers some nights. Here's a situation with street medics taking care of someone. It's another federal agent of some sort. You can see here I got more and more less afraid as this went on, and I would just really get in the mix more once I realized that I probably wasn't going to get hurt that bad, but I did actually get hurt in Portland. But you just kind of realize that they are really non-lethal munitions, and a lot of people here didn't have real guns flying around. So I was able to get closer. Here's a protester being arrested. They put out these signs on the building to actually show each night these projections where they were doing the speeches. This is them trying to pull down the fence. They actually tried to pull down the fence for several nights with ropes and cutting and jumping on it. And then finally on Saturday night, July 25th, they actually got the fence down. And this is the night that I actually got injured. I got shot with rubber bullets and munitions, but just continued to shoot basically. Once this happened, the police took this, or the feds took this as a full-on attack, and they came with very large force. You could see some of the confrontations here. This is what they were up against. You know, it's really crazy to see kind of these handmade shields, people with construction hats, bike helmets, umbrellas. This is what they were like fighting the federal troops with. And we're consistently able to push them back. So about 1 o'clock every morning, or between 1 and 2, the feds actually exited the federal building and attacked the protesters on the streets. There was some question on the legality of this happening every night, because they were really just supposed to be guarding the building, and the building wasn't really under siege so much with the fence. And so that was always one of the questions. And I think there's lawsuits now about, was it legal for them to come out on the street at all and like siege at people like this? This was a powerful image with a priest. This is after the wall came down on the 25th. This is them putting off a tear gas canister. This is got up on a wall one night to kind of show the wall, the overall scene as the tear gas was coming out and flying, just to get a different perspective of the courthouse and the park. You can see right there behind it. Here you can see the veterans lined up again. This is, again, these aren't great photos necessarily, but they're just showing the scene of they're fighting tear gas with leaf blowers and umbrellas. And the pellet guns the umbrellas were effective against the actual pellets that they were shooting. There's a protester just walking through the tear gas to confront the feds. This is them being backed up to their door where they were going to go back in the building. You can kind of see like a closing scene. This was like the last night when they kind of came out with full force again. And I felt like it was even worse than that night the fence came down, when they used everything they had left on the crowd. And this was kind of a closing scene of that door closing, and then we never saw them again. This was, again, different types of tear gas. There were 5 different types of tear gas canisters that I counted there. Some were worse than others. The green flavor, as I called it, was particularly bad. It's a girl getting treated. And this is probably one of my favorite images. This is protesters throwing actual fireworks at the federal troops, and them responding. And then the next day, when the feds were gone, they did a few little symbolic type setups with the American flag and a pig and a police hat. And then this was kind of the last night that the feds actually came out. You could actually see kind of a veteran standing there with them, trying to talk to them and facing off. And then the last few slides that I have are from just a couple weekends ago in Chicago. And I wasn't going to include this, but a couple people told me I should because it's still part of the story. But Chicago, I went to an actual protest that was for mothers whose sons had been killed by the police. It was very emotional as well. This is the mother of Abel Rosales, and her son had been killed by the police. And so there's a lot of emotion this day. While I was in Chicago, things had remained pretty peaceful. Like all weekend, I'd done a couple protests, and then I was staying downtown, and then kind of all hell broke loose on Sunday night, right before I was going to fly out on Monday. And we heard 2 giant bangs, kind of explosions go off outside. And then I heard like hundreds of police cars, and realized that hundreds and hundreds of people had showed up downtown Chicago in response to a police shooting earlier that day, where there kind of been some misinformation that got out online. And basically they were looting. And in all of these cities and all of these places, I had not seen mass looting. I'd seen some windows being broken, I'd seen some vandalism, but I'd never seen just like almost 1,000 people just stealing stuff from high-end, Michigan Avenue stores. And so you have to be very careful with this. Myself and my photo buddy were out, and we were the only 2 people with cameras. Everybody was like, please be careful. There were gunshots flying. He had walked into a active shooter on the way to my hotel. We heard active gunshots all around us. So I chose not to shoot close-up looters and shot some people getting arrested and the aftermath. Kind of followed them down the street. As they finished looting, we would shoot kind of the aftermath of it. Kind of frustrating because some of it was like large businesses like Nordstrom and Macy's and Louis Vuitton. But also, this is a small business that was damaged. And, it's kind of a sad situation. This was actually a DeLaw food and liquor store that was the family owned. So we saw kind of a wide array of businesses that were actually damaged during this looting. So CVS, obviously. And then the Louis Vuitton had a car driven through it and the security guard had been shot, I believe. And by the time we got over there, the bridges were up. I couldn't get across the bridges. This was like 7 a.m. They had already cleaned it up and were boarding it up. So we were out from about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning when it started happening until 6 in the morning, just going store to store, trying to stay back far enough to where we weren't going to get injured or upset the people looting. And this was kind of just my closing shot for the presentation. This was the bridges up in Chicago where they were trying to limit people's movement and not let more people come into the city for looting. And here's my contact information. I am on Instagram. I have not updated my Instagram with all this stuff that I've been working on. It's still mainly music focused. But my website, Amy Harris Photos, is updated. And then I have a music and a travel website if anybody's interested.